Thank you so much, Maya and Ross. If you're like me, you're probably blown away by Doug Parker, CEO of American Airlines, talking about how transformation is everyone's responsibility and certainly not just IT's job. So when I saw a video of the next speaker presenting at the 2019 Rails conference, I immediately started sending it to all my friends, especially Dr. Stephen McGill, who I've been working with for the last 2 years researching the dynamics of the software supply chain. One of the observations made in the information security community is that one of the best ways to stay secure is to simply stay up to date on your software dependencies. It's easy to say, but much more difficult to operationalize because so often when we update our dependencies, everything breaks. Which is why developers avoid updating dependencies in their daily work, and then suddenly discover that production applications have significant vulnerabilities in them. Which is why I'm so excited that our next speaker is going to tell her story. Last year, Eileen Uchitelle was promoted to become a principal engineer at GitHub. She will tell the 7-year journey of how GitHub finally migrated from Rails 2 to Rails 5 and the increasingly dire problems that necessitated it. And she will tell us about all the amazing benefits that it enabled. She has some lessons and some very specific advice that every technology leader needs to hear, because the story she tells is happening to every organization. I'll also mention this. I've been so blown away by every conversation that I've had with her. She's elevated what I think every engineer needs to be doing for their organizations. So here's Eileen.
Hi, everyone. I want to first say thank you to the organizers of DevOps Enterprise Summit for having me speak today. It's an honor to be one of your keynotes, and I hope that you've all enjoyed the conference so far. I'm Eileen Uchitelle, and you can find me anywhere on the internet at Eileen Codes. I'm a staff engineer at GitHub. My focus is on ensuring that the Rails framework and Ruby language support GitHub for the long term. I work on building features and fixing bugs upstream, but also working to improve the GitHub codebase to remove technical debt and build up our resilience. In addition to my work at GitHub, I'm a maintainer and member of the Rails core team. The Rails core team consists of 12 people who work together to decide the future of the Rails framework. We work on what features will be supported or deprecated, when new releases will come out, and foster our community of contributors. Today, we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of Rails at GitHub. While this talk focuses on our history with Rails, and in particular, our massive upgrade, the majority of things I talk about here are applicable to any application written in any language or framework. The original GitHub application and the majority of the application that users interact with today is built on Ruby and Rails. Over the years, we didn't prioritize upgrading and staying on the latest version. At one point, years ago, we forked Rails and practically wrote our own. We fought against the framework, we deviated from the framework, and we even wondered if Rails was right for us at all. But at the end of the day, GitHub is successful because of Rails, and Rails is successful because of GitHub. Once we focused on upgrading Rails, we found that running on the latest version made it possible for us to use and invest in Rails for the long haul in a way that we had never been able to do before. We're now able to change and influence the framework for our needs while also benefiting the broader Rails community and open source ecosystem. This story is part historical. We'll look back at the beginning and how GitHub ended up maintaining a custom fork of Rails. It's also part technical, exploring what compelled us to upgrade our process and why it was so difficult. We'll look at the cost of not upgrading and how technical debt accumulates in your application until it starts to work against your framework. Lastly, we'll dive into our effort at GitHub to clean up technical debt, our commitment to open source, and our responsibility to support Rails for the long haul. Let's go back in time to the beginning. In 2004, DHH announced a new web framework called Ruby on Rails. Immediately, Rails caught the attention of the Ruby community. At RubyConf that year, DHH talked about Rails' history, how it came to be, and why it was better than existing Ruby frameworks. He went on to talk about his philosophy in building the framework, stating that many frameworks fail because they're built without an application to influence the architecture. He said that frameworks are retrospectives. They should be extracted, not built. Rails was attractive and is successful because it was extracted from a real application, Basecamp. In the early years, Rails complexity grew slowly, and Rails 1.0 was released in December of 2005. 2 years later, Rails 1.2 was released. That same year, Tom Preston Warner was at a Ruby meetup in San Francisco when he showed his friend Chris Wainsrath a tool called Grit. Grit was a Ruby tool that allowed you to view Git repositories in an object-oriented way. It would become the basis for Git repos on GitHub. After seeing Grit, Chris was immediately hooked, and a few days later, the GitHub Rails application was born. GitHub was created using Rails 1.2.3, and after a short beta, GitHub was released to the public in April of 2008. The next day, the Rails framework moved off of their own SVN server to using Git on GitHub. In 2009, Rails 2.3 was released. In the early days when Rails would release a new version, GitHub would quickly upgrade to get the new features and bug fixes. But sometime between 2008 and 2009, GitHub forked Rails. Now, remember, this was the Wild West of Rails startups. No one really knew what the future of Rails or GitHub was going to be. We weren't yet talking about the importance of upgrades or staying current with Rails master. And honestly, Rails wasn't as stable as it is today. I don't want to go as far as to say that Rails didn't care about performance or stability at this time, but I know a lot of app developers felt that way. It definitely wasn't a concern the same way it is today. Maybe that's because we were all kind of inexperienced back then, or maybe it was because Rails was good enough for its most important user, Basecamp. Maybe it was because GitHub didn't contribute enough upstream. For whatever reason, the problem wasn't that GitHub just forked Rails and added a bug fix here, a performance improvement there. It wasn't just a fork with backports from upstream. GitHub's fork was Rails with custom code just for GitHub. It was Rails morphed into a different framework that was built for GitHub the way Rails was built for Basecamp.